All right, it seems most people have in a very timely way, brought themselves back from lunch. Well done. So as we've got quite a full afternoon running through to coffee, let's get going. We have 2 keynote speakers and then 3 panel speakers, and the way it's laid out on the program, which I think is a good idea because it's a coherent block, we'll run that through sequentially and then break for coffee as near as possible to 3:10. So it's as I say, it's quite long. This session, as various people are pointing out, is quite strongly Manchester represented. John, do you want to come up? Thank you. Is quite strongly represented, and that fits rather well with our title, of course. I mean, we are the Institute of Science, Ethics and Innovation, and so we simply have the title in a different order for this block. But of course, we are not the principal components by any means. The 2 other speakers, David Hall Matthews and Michal Kritikos, are fitting right in and will be the extremely important part of the procedure. So. I'm sure it's a way of apologising for the representation of IC, but, you know, this is our business, so I'm very happy that we're doing this. I mean, I suppose broadly what we're looking at in this session are issues, above all, of fairness in policy. Sometimes, or a number of the speakers are dealing with conflicts that arise, how we resolve the conflicts between different goals. So David Hall Matthews will start with competing claims of ethics, science and politics. Catherine Rhodes will go on with the gap between commitments and actions of states. Then John Harris, the ethical basis for science and innovation. Annabel Lever, fairness in sharing benefits and burdens. And Michal Kritikos, the ethics review procedure in the European Union. So, David, could you start us off, please? Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much to ISA and the Eugenides Foundation for the invitation. What I'm going to talk about is a specific aspect of sustainability, which is food security. And more specifically still, I'm going to talk about acute and periodic food crises, i.e. famines. And my aim, as John has just said, is to try and discuss different academic ways to approach both famines and the wider problem of global hunger in the context of changes like population growth, problems like climate change, and then consider their policy implications. So in doing so, what I will do is throw up a series of questions about how ethical analysis might add to or sometimes complicate scientific and political economy approaches to food security. I don't promise necessarily to answer many of those questions or to offer any answers at all. I'm sort of hoping that if I throw enough questions in the air, given the collective expertise of the group we have here, at least some of you will be able to answer at least some of the questions, and that can be the basis of our discussion. So, I'm not an expert on ethics, but one of the key aspects of philosophical approaches to famine addresses the question of responsibility. Whose responsibility is it to respond? So we have Honora O'Neill, who asks a moral question. If you are a passerby and you see a child drowning, should you jump in and save them? That's the easy bit. I mean, most people would and should. What if you are a passerby and you see a child starving? This is a very famous picture taken by a photojournalist called Kevin Carter. He won the Pulitzer Prize for this picture of a child starving with a vulture next to it. He was also absolutely pilloried in the press because he was asked the question, what did you do after taking the picture? And he said, well, my job is to take photographs. So I took the picture and then I walked on. And he ended up committing suicide in his 30s after being pilloried. I mean, it wasn't necessarily the only reason, but it certainly was seen as a contribution. How do you save a child from starvation? It's much more complicated than saving a child from drowning. And what if you see, as was this case, not just one, but a large number of children and adults starving? What if, I mean, how can you intervene? At what point should you intervene? I mean, how can you, as an individual, take responsibility for preventing the situation of people starving arising in the first place? How do you stop it from occurring? How do you address global hunger, global poverty? These become too big questions for it to be conceivable for an individual or indeed perhaps an organization to address. So let's start with the national level. What is the responsibility of governments? What are the limits to the responsibilities of government in relation to hunger? Should governments, and do governments, respond to acute food crises in their borders? As a general rule, yes, they do. And this doesn't depend on regime type. I mean, any regime will be in difficulty if they fail to prevent this mass starvation of their population. So the only caveat I would add to this is, does the government actually know that a famine is occurring? It is possible not to. Indeed, the biggest famine in the history of the world in China in the 50s and 60s, which went on for 3 years, it was argued that the Beijing government did not know it was happening because the arms of the state in the rural areas where it was happening were not inclined to tell their bosses that this terrible thing was happening. They wanted to report good news. They didn't want to report bad news, and therefore you didn't get a response. But as long as they know it's happening, you will get a response. So the only problem is that there's this perverse incentive to disguise that it's happening. So Ethiopia in 1975 is another example where in order to not get attacked for failing to respond to famine, the government refused to allow international journalists into the country and did not allow people to realize that there was a famine. And there are other examples. Zimbabwe is the most recent one, where the government has denied that a famine is taking place. But nonetheless, governments will respond in most cases. Do they have a responsibility to prevent famines from happening in the first place? Well, this is more complicated because it depends on what causes famines and how you understand famine causation, which is what I'm going to talk about in a minute. It depends what you understand famine to be. Would you go further? Is it the responsibility of a government not just to prevent large-scale acute crises, but to prevent individual cases of starvation? Where does the boundary lie between the responsibility of the state and the responsibility of individuals or households to look after themselves? These are big and indeed basic political science questions. Specifically, if you get just one or a handful of people starving, I mean, this is where it does depend on regime type, and it depends on things like the media and democracy. So, for example, in the early 90s in the district of Kalahandi in Orissa in India, there were literally 2 or 3 cases a year of starvation deaths, which made the front page headlines in national newspapers in Delhi, which prompted, therefore, the national government to take this seriously and to go to the state government and say, you must do something about this. But at the same time, it prompted the state government to respond, actually, these were not starvation deaths. When you're talking about 2 or 3, you can say, well, actually, in this case, the person ate some roots or leaves or something which weren't unusual, and they poisoned themselves, and that's what killed them. So actually, we don't have that responsibility. But what's significant about the Kalahandi case is that because of the nature of India, because of the nature of the Indian free press and the democracy, you had this scandal which at least incentivized the government to do something about it. That is, of course, not always the case. Do governments have a responsibility to abolish hunger? Well, I think here we're in the realms of the ideal world. It self-evidently is not the case. In some advanced countries, never mind developing countries, that the government is able, and it's therefore quite difficult to ask, even if incentives are the problem. Well, you know, there are, for example, attempts with the Millennium Development Goals, but to halve hunger, not to abolish it. That's not even the ambitious goal of the United Nations. So, as I say, we need to try and establish questions of definition. What is a famine and what causes famines Once we've established that, we can then talk about what the responsibilities of governments are to address them. The trouble is, famine is very difficult to define. It's a bit of an old one, but it's such a classic definition I think it's worth quoting. But in 1968, the International Encyclopedia of Sociology had a section on famine, which begins with the quote, "Famine is a bit like insanity, very hard to define, but impossible to miss when you see it." Now, you know you're in trouble when an encyclopedia, the purpose of which is to provide a definition, starts by refusing to define the term. And indeed, it's arguable that that was a helpful thing to do, because as soon as you try to define it, you get into problems. If you want an easy and straightforward definition of famine, which most people would recognize, you would come up with that. And this is what, important famine writers, the most important of all, Amartya Sen, says, so this is what famine is. It's mass mortality from starvation. There are problems with that. First of all, starvation, a bit like old age, is actually very rare. You don't die of starvation, you die because of starvation. So you would have to at least add that caveat. Secondly, it's really hard to count people who are dying of starvation, especially as it's quite difficult to tell the difference. If somebody dies of starvation-related disease, but when they were hungry in the first place, and how can you tell the difference? I mean, does a cholera death of a hungry person count? How can you tell the difference between a bowel disease? Does a poisoning case count because they ate these unusual foods because they were desperately hungry? So, and also record keeping is not good in famine situations. I mean, in some situations where you have a major relief effort, it might be that you count deaths better than normal, but then it's quite difficult to compare with the baseline. Demographers spend a lot of time trying to estimate in a particular food crisis how many people died more than usual, but usual is normally a jagged line and often incomplete data. So it's quite difficult to establish, and demographers disagree. So the Chinese famine that I mentioned, estimates of how many people died vary from 9 to 15 million. So that means people do not know whether 6 million people died or not. Most important problem with this, though, is that what is the benefit of having a definition of famine which says it's mass mortality? The purpose of having a definition in ethical terms is in order to have an instrumental definition. In other words, a definition which means that we can recognize famine in order to do something about it. If the definition of famine is millions of people have died, it is by definition too late to be useful. So we need a definition which is instrumental, but if we have a definition that's instrumental, in other words, it isn't defined by the consequence of famine, it has to be defined in terms of the cause. And the problem with that is that the cause is not the same in all famines. You cannot generalize about famine causation. This is what you would, if you stop somebody on the street and say, well, what is the cause of famine? This is the most likely answer. And indeed, it is the trigger in a lot of famines, but by no means all. There are famines which are caused by drought and other factors. There are famines where drought isn't even a factor, and of course there are droughts which don't cause famines as well. The other problem I have with this is that if you associate famine with drought as the main cause, that's a very apolitical thing to do. It lets the government off the hook. And I first started studying colonial famines, where the definition given by the British in India in the 1870s was very specific. All famines are caused by the failure of rainfall, failure of crops, and therefore the failure of sustainability of households. And this is deliberate, because if that is the cause, then the cause is not bad economic management, it's not failure to take responsibility on the part of the state. On the other hand, of course, even if you stick to drought, we can argue that this is not what might once have been called a natural famine, because drought can be man-made as well, especially on the one hand in global terms, in terms of climate change.